people, and welcome to this edition of How to Get Into, the show where we take a brief look at a band's entire discography and determine where the best places to start with them are, where to go once you become acquainted, and if necessary, the blemishes and sore spots you should potentially avoid. And for this episode, we're going back to Canada. But man, I'm glad we're going back. It's been what? A good 6-ish years I've been doing this show, and with a few small exceptions, I've devoted almost no time at all to my favorite band ever, Rush. When Rush officially called it quits earlier this year, it all felt so anticlimactic, didn't it? I mean, they released a really solid album in 2012, finally got inducted into the Hall of Fame in 2013.
Blah 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 blah.
We're touring strong up into 2015, and then 2016 rolls around and poof, no more Rush. That's it. No farewell tour, no final album, no great big final hurrah, just, we're done. Which, granted, a fair amount of that was due to legitimate health concerns, and the guys didn't have any regrets about it or anything. It seemed like a reasonable way for them to go out. At least in their eyes. They felt that they had said what they wanted to say, and were content just leaving it be. That's very respectable to a certain degree. I mean, you know, how many farewell tours has Ozzy done so far? So strap in, because we got a lot of ground to cover. And I should make it known that I'm only covering major mainstream releases. So LPs and EPs, basically. No live albums, no side projects this time.
Low-key, I will say you totally should check out most of Rush's live discography. It's pretty big, and there's a lot to choose from there, but it's all pretty solid. You can't go too wrong, neither here nor there.
And like I did with the last How to Get Into episode, I have to stress, this is only my personal opinion here. Like, please don't take any of the stuff I say here as gospel. Your mileage is bound to vary with some of these albums. I'm just trying to give you my personal perspective as a long-time, fairly hardcore Rush fan, where the best places to get into this band are. But please, don't, crucify me by any of this, okay? Let's start the journey off with some must-hears. Oh, don't look at me like that. I did my best to try to whittle things down. Rush has a lot of good albums, guys. They're really good. I know, I'm a fanboy, so of course I'm gonna have a lot to squee about. But guys, Rush's catalog really is that solid. Bands that usually stick around for this long usually have a few methods as to how they do it. Sometimes they only change so little in their sound that they basically can't go wrong, or they'll change things up a lot, but they'll have big, long stretches in their career where they just kinda suck. Hell, some people would argue Rush actually went through that themselves, but we'll get into that a little later. Rush was not only constantly changing, but most of the twists and turns and different eras of their sound are all pretty consistently good. Sans a few small exceptions. Out of a catalog so vast, epic, and eclectic, how the hell are you supposed to narrow that all down? Well, I guess I'll just be an unoriginal bastard and tell you the two albums that I think all of us can agree are absolute must-listens from this band's discography. Moving Pictures and 2112. There's really not too much else I can say here about these albums necessarily. I mean, at least not much that hundreds of other people in the industry have said before. They're definitive, core, essential albums to rock music, prog music, and music in general. If you want to get your first taste of Rush, even I gotta say, it has to be one of these two albums. Though even then I can kind of understand why people kind of have trouble with this band, because, you pick up an album like 2112, you take one look at that first track and you're like, God damn, 20 minutes on one song? That's like 2 episodes of SpongeBob, dude. Gee. Look, I'm just gonna say it, people. Hard truth time. I know that run length looks intimidating to some of you, but trust me, you have to do it. Hunker down, make a sandwich, grab a snack, do whatever you gotta do to sit through this, because people, it's debatably the best 20 minutes in rock history. The sweeping guitar melodies, the thunderous and insane beats, the exquisitely executed shifts in tone, scale, and scope, and even the unconventional narrative behind this song. Oh, for absolutely anyone that believes music can be more than just a catchy tune, this is your blueprint. While Rush were far from the first prog band, and 2112 was far from the first prog album, no one can deny the influence this one little song had on an entire genre. This is the album that went on to launch 1,000 bands, and God knows it'll launch 1,000 more before all is said and done. Attention all planets of the Solar Federation, we have assumed control. 2112, the song, is a big listen. Believe me, I understand that. And if you just have to have it condensed in some form, a lot of their greatest hits collections tend to include a version that just has the first 2 movements condensed into like a proto-single kind of thing. I get that it's a challenging song, but people, you just have to trust me on this. You just have to take the dive, take the risk, and listen to this track. Believe me, you will not be disappointed. Oh, and all this talk about 2112 the song almost makes you forget that, like, the rest of the album also kicks a lot of ass, too. The A-side to this album tends to get most of the love when people discuss 2112, but don't forget, the rest of the album is actually really, really great too. This record basically serves as a final send-off for the band's early period. Their more bluesy, 70s rock, Zeppelin-influenced years, a period that I affectionately call Dumb Rush. I don't mean that as an insult or anything, it's just that era where Rush was more of a prototypical 70s rock act. They started out like a lot of bands in the early 70s. They played thick, heavy guitar riffs, wrote songs about girls, drinking, and going to work. They were always talented, but their more ambitious side didn't really completely blossom out until this record. And the B-side is those last little vestiges of that classic rock side of their sound, just finally coming to a conclusive end. Almost everything Rush would work on beyond this point would be very thoughtful, experimental, something meant to break the boundaries of what rock could be. This album here, this is like the last time Rush can be a band that just writes a dumb song about weed. Ooh, look at me. I am the best at weed smoke. We're a progressive band. Ah! Twilight Zone is also just a fun little song about how awesome the Twilight Zone is.
Beneath his head, the strangest noise. Take it up, he's got 3 eyes.
You see what I mean? Rush never really got this derpy after this album. At least not intentionally. So the B-side to 2112 almost serves as like a cool send-off, a final adieu to their more boogie-woogie, simplistic style of song crafting. One last hurrah, just for the fun of it. It alleviates the tone from the more heavy and depressing title track and shows you that these guys still have a sense of humor about themselves. Hey, they aren't completely buried up their own ass, you know? Lessons is a nice little smooth jam centered around pleasant acoustic strumming. Tears is a nice, simple, and somber little ballad. And Something for Nothing absolutely roars this album to a close. people, I could talk all day about how massively wonderful and important 2112 is. Hell, maybe someday I will. But that's just one of the super big albums out of the way. Now let's talk about the other big Rush album you've probably heard everything about, Moving Pictures. Again, this is another album that barely needs any introduction. It probably needs even less of an introduction than 2112 does. This was Rush's biggest commercial success. 4 times platinum, 2 hit singles, and so much airplay on rock radio to this day that, well, you're probably sick to death of that whole I mean, if most of you know absolutely anything about this band, it's that today's Tom Sawyer, he gets high on you. And the space he invades, he gets by on you. Is this funny yet? I'm just gonna keep doing it till it's funny. But people, again, it's an album that deserves all of the praise it gets. Hell, it's one of those albums that's so good, even tracks that weren't singles went on to become classic rock staples. Yeah, Red Barchetta was never officially a single, but it's become one of Rush's most readily identifiable songs. Hell, YYZ. Just a side note, the song title is actually pronounced YYZ. It's a Canadian song written by Canadians. The title is literally taken from the Toronto International Airport. It's Zed. You know, just laying that out there. I personally won't tear your head off over the pronunciation, but there are some Rush fans who totally will. I'm just warning you.
It's Zed, and no, Neil Peart stands alone.
That song is a goddamn instrumental, and it's also become one of their biggest songs ever. Like, you know an album is good when people are demanding to hear its instrumental deep cuts. People, do not underestimate Moving Pictures. It's a rager. After the band won their war to be weird with 2112's success, they went on to be, well, pretty weird for a while. They spent the last half of the 70s writing these monster, huge albums with crazy, complicated arrangements, even more epic storylines, and even more long running times. But by the 80s, the guys were completely burnt out on making that style of music, so they spent the majority of 1980 and 1981 figuring out what a less intense version of Rush could sound like. And as it turns out, yeah, less intense is a really damn good look for them. It's the best of both worlds, this album. It's got your crazy, complicated songs to please the music snobs and musical gearheads, but for the average listener, it's also got outstanding melodies and wonderful, heartfelt lyrics. This is another one of those albums that just defines classic rock. This is the one record that I think almost anyone could listen to and get something good out of it. For as bold and outrageous as this album can get, it's so insanely accessible, especially for a Rush album. It's a challenging listen that never feels challenging, ever, and that is the hardest kind of album you can write. But again, Rush did it, and they did it so well that, again, it would serve as another blueprint for future bands to come. If you want to get into Rush at the ground level, then this is the album you should start with. Although, I could easily say every single one of those same things about this album as well. Permanent Waves. This album. Why don't we talk more about this album? Hot take. This album's equally as good as Moving Pictures. In fact, hell, this is my personal favorite Rush album. Not that it doesn't get any love at all. You know, stuff like Free Will and Spirit of Radio are constantly playing all over any radio stations that'll have them. But I don't know, for some reason we just don't talk about this one nearly as much, do we? This album helped blaze the trail for Moving Pictures, though. Without this album's success, Moving Pictures would probably have never happened. Like I mentioned previously, the band spent the late 70s in a bit of a bloated, self-indulgent phase, but this was the album that kicked them, for lack of a better term, out of their comfort zone. God, I wouldn't say anything Rush has ever done has been comfortable. But this got them making more outright bangers, more radio-friendly stuff. Stuff that you didn't have to lose your mind over to get into, you know? This was Rush at their most streamlined, their most efficient, their most absolute world-conquering. The album opens with Spirit of Radio, and this is the very first thing you hear when you put this album on.
Oh, that fucking riff!
Oh, God, the minute you hear that riff, you just slam your money on the table and say, I'm in. The rest of the instruments come in, it just gels into this super song that mixes all kinds of elements from hard rock, electronica, reggae even in there. The guys were listening to a lot of The Police back around the time these records were made, and believe me, it shows all throughout. And it works really well, too. God, thanks, Sting.
The songs here are still complex and intriguingly structured and developed, while still remaining wholeheartedly fun, catchy, and accessible. Hell, this is actually one of Rush's more emotional and thoughtful feeling albums. It's really one that can tug on your heartstrings a bit. It's kinda nuts.
Songs like Entre Nous and Different Strings are just so touching. This album deals with a lot of topics like relationships, feelings, emotional growth, and nuance. You know, all that emo crap. It's probably one of their more personal and vulnerable albums. And man, the emotion rings true all throughout. The band clearly had a lot of baggage they wanted to unpack with this one, and I'd say they did a fine job of it. Again, it's not an album that a lot of people tend to bring up when talking about the all-time classics of the genre, but personally, I believe it deserves to be on that list just as much as Moving Pictures. It's just as important, if not vital, to Rush's sound, and it finally definitively showed us that Rush didn't have to make a big-ass epic concerto in order to wow us. This was the record that illustrated once and for all that Rush wasn't just a big bag of gimmicks or an overly elaborate novelty act that had to rely on grandiosity in order to be impressive. No, at their very core, Rush was damn good. And they didn't need to write megalithic meta-symphonies in order to create magical music. Making modern music can still be open-hearted. It's really just a question of your honesty.
Although, it sounds like I'm knocking the more operatic style this band went through in the 70s, and I promise you, I'm totally not. This band did some amazing stuff in their operatic phase, some of their best work ever. Case in point, Hemispheres.
Okay, homie, you want complex, you want complicated, you want a damn challenge that's gonna make your fretboards melt and snap your drumsticks like Macho Man tearing into a Slim Jim? Here you go. Jam out to this bad boy. It's only 4 tracks and just barely over 36 minutes, but holy shit. You want something that's a goddamn technical masterpiece? This is your album. Also, that booty.
This is the last LP we got from Rush's more true progressive era. Or, to put it another way, Rush has always been a proggy band, but this album is them at their most experimental, their most out there, their most mind-melting, their most bizarre. And I'll be damned if it's not absolutely spellbinding.
If not, like, a teensy bit on the self-indulgent side. But, you know, I can't even fault them for that here. Hell, the subtitle to La Via Stringata is an exercise in self-indulgence. I mean, they knew exactly what they were doing on this one, cheeky little pricks. They knew. Though this is one of those rare cases where a band buries their head way too far up their own asses, but actually finds gold nuggets at the end of their journey, instead of, the other kind. This is an album that, by all means, shouldn't work at all. It's kind of an album that's almost tailor-made to piss me off. It starts off with a song that's literally part 2 of a narrative that was left off from the last album without so much as a previously on. It's only 4 tracks long. One of those tracks is literally about the goddamn trees. Riveting. And the last song is a 9-minute instrumental that's broken up into 12 pieces that... What? Huh? What the fuck are you going on about? You're high as fuck! But I will be damned if this album doesn't work. Completely. It's gorgeous. The Cygnus Suite is an excellent piece, regardless of which order you hear it in. Circumstances is a wonderful tune that I think every post-collegiate should hear. It's about going after your dreams and failing miserably. Believe me, it'll be pretty relatable at that age. And the trees, I joke, and it is kind of a goofy song, but it's still one of their top tier entries. And like I said, if you want to challenge, motherfucker, La Via Stringata is your boy.
Probably the hardest song I ever learned how to play was La Via Stringata. The drumming it takes everything you got to get through it.
That was the benchmark of drumming when I was a kid. I could play YYZ, but can you play La Via Stringata?
See, Mike Portnoy agrees with me.
Rush is a band that's been celebrated and even mocked for some of their grandiose compositions, and admittedly, in some places, those more elaborate songs and structures aren't as well executed, but here it's all aces. If you want a taste of the proggier side of this band, the absolute most extreme Rush you can get, this album is just a wonderful place to go. This thing absolutely wrecks. Even if it also wrecks your psyche along with it. Woo! God damn. But okay, you want to talk weird? You want to talk about a really weird side of their catalog? Let's talk synthesizers. Oh, fuck off. Don't give me any of that. Okay, people. Every Rush fan out there is different and unique, and I am not even beginning to claim to speak for all of them. But amongst the general population, you could say there are 2 major fundamental camps. The side that's generally okay with Rush's, quote, 80s synth period, and the type who are...
How motherfucking dare you! Not my Rush! Not my Rush! Rush don't use no keyboards! Keyboards is for pop shit, for boy bands, and the gays. Rush ain't no synth band! Rush ain't no Duran Duran shit! I will shove this autographed picture of John Rutsey right up my ass!
I do not fall into the latter category. I personally love Rush's synth period. I can't get enough of their synthwave era. Though it is a very contentious side to this band's catalog, and even for as big of a fan as I am, I wouldn't say it's very representative of the bulk of their sound, so for the must-hear section, I decided to limit my choices to one album. We will only talk about one synth period Rush album on this side of the list. And just to piss everybody off, it's not the album that everyone would probably expect me to pick. And how's them out? Yeah, believe it or not, for my money, the best synth period Rush album is easily Grace Under Pressure. Most people tend to go with Signals when picking out a favorite of this era, but Rush were never more on point with their electronica elements than they were on this record. Neil had started implementing electronic pieces to his drum kit, and way more emphasis was placed on Geddy's keyboard work. By this album, the guys were fully committed to the idea of using synths, and they used them all extremely well. This is an 80s-ass 80s album, but it's also very timeless in its own weird way. Rush were still in their police worshipping phase, so they were still incorporating tons of ska, reggae, calypso, and even Caribbean beats and structures into their music, and it all gives it this delightfully bouncy and groovy kind of feel, particularly on tracks like Kid Gloves, Red Lenses, and The Enemy Within. Fun fact, actually, did you know that this video here was the first video ever shown on Much Music? Bet you didn't know that. Well, I mean, unless you're Canadian. And, you know, old. This album is stellar both musically and lyrically. It's a record that, I don't know, it's not something you'd expect from Rush's synth period, but it can get you right in the feels sometimes. In fact, this might be one of the heaviest albums they've ever made lyrically, more so than Permanent Waves even. It touches on a lot of difficult topics. After Image covers the tragic and sudden death of one of their producers in a motorcycle accident. The Enemy Within touches on insecurities, self-doubt, and rampaging inner anxiety. Something I can totally relate to. The Body Electric is a frightening little story about a robot that gains sentience and immediately begins losing its mind. It's very Philip K. Dick or Harlan Ellison in a way. It's a very good song, but I feel like it'd also make a pretty good novella. Neither here nor there. And Red Sector A. Red Sector A is literally about actual experiences from inside Nazi concentration camps in World War II. See, Geddy Lee's mother was actually a survivor of the Holocaust. Apparently she was held in the same camp that Anne Frank and her family were held prisoner.
You know, she was in Auschwitz, and then she was in Bergen-Belsen, really two of the most horrible places.
Were they, that no one was really expected to survive from?
No, no.
While writing this album, Geddy asked her to recount some of the experiences she'd had while she was there, and
in the late 30s, when the Germans rolled in, it sort of started to ghettoize the town, and my parents actually met in one of the work camps because they got the young people to do all the building of the camps. So basically they'd do all the manual labor, and then they'd be incarcerated in that camp. So really fun deal for them.
Did you have other family members that died?
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, on my father's side, they almost all perished. I think my father had 6 or 7 brothers and sisters, and only 3 survived. So I lost my grandparents. I never knew them on my mom's side and on my dad's side.
I once asked my mother her thoughts upon being liberated, Lee says during a phone conversation. She didn't believe liberation was possible. She didn't believe that if there was a society outside the camp, how they could allow this to exist. So she believed society was done in. See this right here? This is why I have absolutely no problem with people punching Nazis. This is an album that delivers on the music and delivers on the emotional punch. People often like to cite that Rush is one of the goofier prog acts, and it's not like they aren't completely without a sense of humor.
Oh yeah! Modern day warrior named Tom Sawyer. He floated down a river on a raft with a black guy.
But when they really want to, they can just grab you by the collar and say,
Hey, hey! Feel it. Feel it, dude. Feel it. Feel your feelings, fool. Feel it. Oh, wait, that's the wrong album.
I believe that Rush's synth period is something you should check out, at least in passing. And if you want to see what this weird little period was like at its high watermark, I say it's this album.
But Crash, all of these albums are super old. Everything you've listed since you started came out before you were even born. And you're old as fuck. Don't you like anything they've done more recently?
Who are you, strange Kermit-voiced person? No, okay. Yeah, you know what? I've been doing the bad classic rock geek thing and focusing on all their old shit. You want something a little newer? Bam, here you go. Vapor Trails. Okay, well, 16 years isn't exactly recent, but fuck off, I'm trying. I can't even begin to get into the backstory behind this record. It's long and tragic and twisty and so very sad. Either check out this movie, Rush Beyond the Lighted Stage, or read this book Neil Peart wrote about his time leading up to this album. Both come highly recommended, but the super duper duper short version, Neil sent his daughter off to college. On her way to her first day of classes, she's killed in a car accident. Around the same time, Peart's wife develops cancer, and 10 months later, she passes away too. Distraught by all this, Neil basically just gets on his motorcycle and drives and drives and drives and holy shit! The band went on a very long hiatus after this, and precisely 0 people could blame them for it. I mean, they basically skipped out on the late 90s entirely, and more power to them. But in 2002, after a long period of mourning and rebuilding and healing, the guys got back together, fired out an album, and completely blew us away all over again. Man, this album is absolutely amazing. For one, this is officially the band taking a gigantic stake to the heart of the synthesizer period. Just bam, 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 bam. Finally, dead. Even though I generally like the synthesizer period, at the stage it was at, whew, boy, it needed to die. We'll touch on that more a little later. But this was their first album since the goddamn 70s to not feature any synthesizers or electronica elements, period. And as a result, this ended up being the heaviest album they'd made in years, potentially ever. This thing is an absolute juggernaut of force. To see that the boys still had this kind of edge, this kind of power, this kind of intensity, the ability to still rock the house like a goddamn wrecking ball, was something that I think caught a lot of people off guard. Not since maybe Fly By Night had they ever just brought the riffs and the beats this goddamn heavy. They had been trying to do it for years, mind, but this was the album that finally got them across the finish line. This album, such a punch in the face. It's great. And again, this is a record that just gets you right in the feels, man. Earthshine, Secret Touch, Ghostwriter, so many of these songs. Oh, Neil just took his pain, his suffering, his agony during all that time and created a set of lyrics that just absolutely tugs at your humanity. This album makes you feel it, absolutely, inside and out. It's an album about healing. It's an album about recovery. It's an album about nurturing your little baby soul with motion until you can get whole again. People, the book that Neil wrote on his experiences on the road is so worth a read. Pick it up and pick up this album too. It's an absolute treasure. But, get this version of the album, not this version of the album. I cannot stress that enough. And believe me, we will get into that a little later, but please, this version of the album. Whew, oh man, so much great stuff this band has done. How far along are we into the video? Oh, god damn it, okay? We'd seriously better move on to next steps. Holy shit, dude. So like I mentioned during the Grace Under Pressure segment, I am a staunch defender of synth rush. And as some of you with a keen eye probably noticed, yes, every other synth album is on this part of the list, but god damn it, people, if you just turn your nose up at it all immediately for not being traditional rock, you are seriously denying yourself some of the best music this band ever made. And I'm going to drive that point home to you with what has to be Rush's second best electronic era album, Hold Your Fire. I'm just pissing off everybody today, aren't I? People, I have not yet begun to hot take. Strap in. Yeah, this album right here, this is a me choice. Because again, this album just does not get a lot of love, and it totally deserves more. Hell, even a lot of other synth period defenders would look at this album and say this was where it all started to become too much. And you know, in a way, I can even agree with them on that. This was the album that was just maximum synth. It's coated in electronica, just so heavily doused in all that mid to late 80s synth cheese, it can almost be intimidating. And to those people that loved this style of Rush, hearing this for the first time probably turned a few heads. I mean, just imagine the poor guy back in the day who probably skipped out on Rush for a long time, kind of forgot they were around, and then suddenly saw this album sitting on the shelf of like a Sam Goody or whatever, and was like, oh, hey, Rush is still around? Oh, I wonder what they sound like. Huh? It's 80s cheese at some of its most cheesy. But come on, people, cheese can be great. This album is definitely cheesy, but it's an excellent cheese. It's prime Gouda. It's camembert with rosemary and cucumber spread on a high-quality cracker. It's that kind of cheese. Believe me, when we get to other albums of this period, you'll notice that the cheese hasn't kept nearly as well. But people, tracks like Force 10, Second Nature, Prime Mover, Lock and Key, Mission, and one of my all-time favorite Rush songs, Time Stands Still, with, to my knowledge at least, Rush's only official feature on a single. And it's a young Amy Mann of all people. God damn. Bravo, Rush. Bravo. Excellent goddamn choice there. People, this is an album you can put on and just every track is a banger. It never lets up. It's one of their more consistent pieces of work, weirdly enough. I mean, there is a reason Rush always keeps songs from this album on their live rotation, regardless of how hard the music snobs may sneer at it. And there's a reason classic radio still plays some of these tracks, even to this day. This album is better than a lot of people give it credit for. Though, I mean, yeah, I get why people have trouble with it. I totally get it. Listen to this damn thing. I get why people have trouble with this album. But if you can separate Rush's heritage from what this album is and what it's trying to accomplish, if you can take it in on its own merits as just an album of the 80s, it's fantastic. I promise you, this album holds up a lot better than you've probably heard. Like, come on. This was probably about as far as Rush ever deviated from their classic sound. This is probably the least Rush-sounding Rush album you can find. But even then, it still makes for an amazing listen. It's an odd duck, it's a dark horse, call it whatever animal you want to call it, but I call this album great. But okay, let's move on to the next album that's obviously the better album from their synth period, Power Windows. Feed me with your hate! Feed me with your hate! Feed me with your hate! Yeah, throwing you another curveball here, I know. But look, this album's terrific too. While it's not nearly as controversial as Hold Your Fire tends to be, this was also an album that, while a lot of people have praised it over the years, people also tend to forget this one exists. Kinda. And to be fair, that's probably because out of all the synth period stuff, this one is kind of the least accessible. And also this god-awful cover art. I'm sorry, but just... oh! But still, songs like Big Money and Mystic Rhythms have totally stood the test of time, and people do generally still look back on this one with a lot of fondness when they remember it exists, even though this was the album where the electronica was starting to really pile up. I mean, just listen to a song like Mystic Rhythms.
We suspend our disbelief. We are not alone. Mystic.
This is the same band that did this, by the way. But those elements aren't nearly to the extent of Hold Your Fire, which is why I think a lot of people look back at this one with a bit more rose tint in their glasses. In fact, if you have trouble with this album, this one might be more of an easy transition for you. It's still pretty heavily smeared in all that 80s synth, and it isn't quite as single-friendly as our last couple of albums were. I mean, again, Mystic Rhythms is an amazing song, but these guys just had balls the size of hot air balloons. This was a single! This was a damn single! Can you even... ah! Old school fans were kinda losing their nuggets hardcore by the time this album reared its ugly, synth-smeared little head. But Geddy's bass and Alex's guitar work is still very prominent in the mix and wholeheartedly enjoyable. They're still absolutely in love with reggae and ska beats here. I mean, Geddy's bass in Big Money, Neil's monolithic drums on Mystic Rhythms. I keep bringing up that song, don't I? I'm sorry, I really like Mystic Rhythms. That solo in a motion detector, just pieces of old school Rush are still in here if you gotta have something like that to anchor you in the sound. It's just got a much braver, bolder sound of the time to it. It was modern and fresh for its time. But again, this is an 80s album, and some elements to this haven't kept quite as well. If you just despise everything about 80s music, I probably still won't be able to sell you on this one. But if you've got an open mind and a love for synths, this is definitely one that's up your alley. Oh, alright, fine. Now we'll talk about Signals. Oh, I feel like I'm kind of throwing poor Signals under the bus a wee bit here. Signals isn't bad. I didn't mean to talk it up like it was bad or anything. It's not bad. It's great. Believe me, it wouldn't be on this side of the list if it wasn't good. It's a terrific album. Hell, this is the album that basically kicked off their electronica era, and it still holds up really well today. Analog Kid is a fun little romp. Digital Man is Rush taking that reggae, ska, and police worship to its absolute highest element. New World Man is a lovely, driving little banger. Losing It is a humbling and cripplingly sad song. And it's a song about getting older, too, which, remains pretty pertinent to my ever-fossilizing ass. And anyone who knows anything about the synth period knows that Subdivisions is one of, if not the pinnacles of this era. Like, this is probably the most celebrated Rush synth track. If you know anything about this era of Rush, it's most likely this song right here. Which is kind of weird when you really think about it, because out of all the other stuff from this period of Rush, this song here is kind of the most shallow? I mean, it's not on the same level of, dumb Rush songs, but it's just a song about how suffocating modern suburbia can be and how isolating and alienating high school and social cliques are. It doesn't really say too much outside of, wow, being a kid in the suburbs sucks.
Y'all don't know what it's like. Be a middle class and white.
It's not a bad song, but it is one of those tracks that I think is maybe just a teensy bit overrated. Partially because of the lyrics and partially due to my overall issue with this particular album. They just aren't fully committed to the synths yet. I love Rush's synth period. I love the hell out of it. But I think this period is at its best when it's fully synthed the fuck out, man. I mean, I'm the weirdo that likes Hold Your Fire, for God's sake. You know I got me a heavy taste for the synthy shit. On here, while this was the boldest step into that sound that they'd made up to that point, it's kinda clear they're still trying to get their footing here. I'm just saying, it's a little sloppy and uneven at times, at least for my tastes. And while everybody loves subdivisions, you ever notice that you don't hear too many other tracks from this album out in the wild? You don't, do ya? I mean, when was the last time you heard anyone talk about, like, Chemistry or Countdown, you know? Again, it's not a bad album at all. In fact, if you're just super duper leery about anything that might have those scary, spooky synths in it, this might be the best way to help edge you into that side of their sound gradually, as that particular element isn't quite on full blast just yet. But speaking as someone that likes that element on full blast, hey though, I'm not trying to judge anybody for digging on this one. This is an album that will likely be more of an easy fit for you noobs trying to get into this era, and it has some undeniable classics on it for sure. It's just not my personal fave, but hey, you do you. Go nuts. You'll probably love this one. It's terrific. Oh, all this polarization and hot takes and all this nonsense. I think I might be starting to lose some of you guys. How about I extend an olive branch with an album that I think most of us can pretty much agree completely kicks ass? Oh man, this was one that was hard to keep off of the must-hears section because frankly, this one is an absolute blast. It's got all those thick, meaty riffs that the early 70s were known for, all that wonderfully gorgeous instrumentation and composition that Rush were always known for, and this album marks the beginning of an era, the moment when Rush finally became themselves, because this was the first album to feature Neil Peart on drums. Before any of you give me shit about the name pronunciation.
Ear with a P in front of it and a T at the end. Peart.
Peart.
I mispronounce it all the time too. Sorry, Neil. And man, what a debut he made too. Just listen to him absolutely killing it on songs like Best I Can, the title track, and especially Beneath, Between, and Behind. God damn, Peart is playing like he has everything to prove. Not that John Rutsey was ever a bad drummer. God damn, my ears are burning. Have I been summoned? Ah, well, I hope you die from the AIDS gun, Mr. Crash Thompson. Foghead is Lord! But Neil's presence just completely reinvented this band overnight. Rush went from yet another dumb group you'd put on the jukebox to... whoa. Their debut proved that they were good. Fly By Night proved that they had the potential to be amazing. So why is it a next step then and not a must listen? Well, for as amazing as this album is, it does have some pretty rough edges to it. It's a transitory album for Rush, and like a lot of other transitory albums, it's not the cleanest of transitions. For one, there is an outright jarring disconnect in its lyrics, themes, and tone. It's a wildly uneven album thematically. See, this was also the first album where they let Neil start writing lyrics for the band, and man, you can really tell which songs are Neil's and which songs are the other guys'. We're still in the dumb Rush era, but you'll have more songs like Beneath, Between, and Behind serving as a subtle, searing critique of the slow degradation of the American dream ideal, or Rivendell being this eloquent and overly flowery bit of prose, ripping pages pretty much straight out of J.R.R. Tolkien's book. You'll have songs like that, but then you'll also get stuff like Best I Can, which is about
I'm not your buddy, friend. He's not your friend, guy. I'm not your guy, buddy. He's not your buddy, friend. Fuck you, buddy.
And look, I'm not knocking those songs for being simplistic or anything, not at all. The simpler tracks are also very excellent tunes. But as Rush grew, they quit writing about, quote, simple topics really goddamn fast.
Rush is a band that's known for writing all about things like history, philosophy, science, literature, huge, weighty concepts with very thought-out intellectual discussions. They were a big band that wrote about big topics. Stuff like, hey, touring's fun! They grew out of that phase fairly quickly, and hearing a lot of that older stuff that's way less ambitious today, knowing what we know now at least, it just has kind of a weird look to it.
Not that they didn't try to do some of the more lofty stuff on this album. In fact, this is the place where it first got its start. Bytor and the Snow Dog marks their first major attempt at more narratively driven songwriting, and the music on this track is certainly wicked as hell. But it's far from perfect. You know how 2112 is about this futuristic dystopia with a rich background and history, and the actions of the narrator go on to have massive, sweeping consequences that change the entire shape of the world and even the universe itself? Well, by comparison, Bytor and the Snow Dog, there's a guy called Bytor, there's a Snow Dog, they fight, Snow Dog wins.
It brought a shovel, but the hole it digs isn't exactly deep.
I think they were trying for some kind of bigger concept here, but the writing comes off so vague that the song could pretty much mean anything, or it could mean absolutely nothing. I've heard 1,000 different theories as to what this is supposed to be about. I don't know what to tell ya. Hell, Genius currently states that it's about the guys arguing over who would play guitar in the band. I hadn't heard that one before, but I'm just saying, if this is the very first Rush album you listen to, it could potentially give you the wrong idea on this group. But hey, it's still great. It's still fantastic. Check out at least a handful of the best, and then get knocked off your ass all over again by this little beauty.
Yeah. Since I don't have a transition into this, how about we just talk about 90s Rush for a little bit?
Oh, the late 80s and early 90s. What a precious little garbage fire you were. Some of the worst pop and rock music ever comes from this weird little period. Not that there weren't great songs and artists that sprung forth from this era and served as an exception to the rule, sure, but take one look at, say, any of the Billboard charts of that time, and it's like, ew! No! Fuck! And Rush themselves would even be affected by this, but again, we'll get into that a little later. For now, though, let's focus on 1993. Now by this time, Rush had basically cemented themselves as a classic rock band. They'd been going at it for 25 years by the time Counterparts would drop, but as you probably know, the music, or at least the rock music of 1993, was dominated by one big word. Yeah, in the era of Nirvana, Alice in Chains, and Pearl Jam, a lot of classic rock acts really suffered. Again, not that there weren't exceptions, Van Halen, Aerosmith, etc. Some of the old guard was still kicking around and kicking ass, but a lot of them were really not having a great time, and Rush themselves, at least during this period, were coming off of two of the weakest albums they would ever release. So this record, and the 1996 follow-up, Test for Echo, should probably be pretty dire, all things considered, right?
Actually, no, not really.
While these albums definitely still feel a bit confused, perhaps even a bit directionless, you could say, I'd say they still contain some of the best later era stuff these guys would create, and songs like Driven and Animate are some of the band's own personal favorites. While these albums can definitely be spotty, and they have their moments of lull, my god, there are some tracks across these two records that work so goddamn well on their own, at least, that I would hate for you to overlook them. That's part of the reason I'm covering these two albums together. I'd still say they're both really great albums, but they suffer from a similar issue: a lack of cohesion. Some songs from these albums they work fantastically well, but as albums,
Not quite so much.
But people, Animate, Stick It Out, Nobody's Hero, Leave That Thing Alone, Cold Fire, Everyday Glory, Test for Echo, Driven, Half the World, The Color of Right, Totem, Virtuality, Resist. Man, you can't miss out on this stuff. It's so good. Oh, especially Resist. That's another huge personal favorite from me.
Oh man, this song in particular is really great because, well, back when they were still touring, they would always play this song after Neil's crazy, fantastic, elaborate, 15 goddamn minute long drum solo at every show. Seriously, you people have not lived until you've heard a Neil Peart solo. And after Neil was done, he would just disappear for a little bit. He'd go off into the back, I assume to pass out, while Alex and Getty would come out with acoustic guitars and just play a very cool, very sweet rendition of this song just on acoustics. It was always great. It was a nice sort of pace breaker for the show. Oh, God, I wish they still toured.
I'm just saying, these albums really don't get a lot of love or attention necessarily. Again, partially because during this period, they had yet to completely shake off the funk of their late 80s, early 90s period. They're transitionary albums, but they were still doing some pretty damn good stuff. These albums, they aren't without their issues, sure, but there's just too much from this period that I absolutely adore for me to tell you to just give it a pass. It's not the band at their strongest at all, but even when they aren't at 100%, it's amazing how well Rush can still deliver. Worth a listen if you're feeling it.
God damn, what an amazing band. What an amazing, wonderful, talented, just spellbinding group. We were so lucky to get a group like this. How far into the video are we? Oh, for fuck's sake! God damn it, I said I wasn't gonna do any more long videos. Well, this is where we'll have to cut it short for now. We'll have to split this video into two parts, so guys, thank you very much for joining us here for part one. Hopefully this has given you some good jumping on points at least to get started with your adventure into Rush. Thanks for tuning in, and I will catch you guys in the next video, where we'll discuss some of the places to go once you're ready to dig a little deeper, as well as some of the places that you should proceed with caution or just flat out avoid. Guys, thanks again for watching. I've been Crash Thompson, and remember, the only opinion that really matters is your own.
Catch you in the next video, people. What the fuck is an AIDS gun?
Super special thanks to Mo Madison, Keller Oram, and Jack Brunton.